"Look at her," the bartender whispered, wiping the mahogany counter with trembling hands. She had the last maitre d' hospitalize just for serving the wrong vintage. Elena looked across the dimly lit, velvet-draped dining room. Sitting at the corner table was the woman everyone feared. The Mafia boss's fiancée. She was wrapped in emerald silk, her eyes cold, her posture flawless. The staff hovered like frightened sparrows, terrified of making a single mistake. But as Elena picked up the silver tray, she noticed something no one else did. Beneath the table, hidden from the terrifying man sitting across from her, the fiancée's knuckles were white, and her hands were shaking. Elena stepped forward. Everything was about to change. The kitchen of L'Ombra was a battleground of polished steel, open flames, and orchestrated panic. For Elena, it was simply the third week of survival. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, white truffles, and the sharp tang of reduction sauces. Chefs shouted in rapid-fire bursts, plates clattered against the pass, and the oppressive heat stuck to the back of Elena's neck beneath the stiff, high collar of her black uniform. She needed this job. The pay was triple what she made at the diner, and the tips from the city's untouchable elite were enough to keep her sister's medical debts from drowning them both. But the cost was a constant, suffocating anxiety. Marcus, the maitre d', stood by the swinging double doors, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He clapped his hands sharply, demanding silence from the floor staff. "They are here," Marcus announced, his voice dropping to a hushed, terrified register. "Table 7, Adrian and Isabella." A collective, jagged breath hitched in the throats of the waitstaff. Elena adjusted her apron, watching as a seasoned waiter named Thomas visibly swallowed hard. In the 3 weeks Elena had worked at L'Ombra, she had learned the mythology of the restaurant's most infamous patrons. Adrian was the architect of the city's shadow economy, a man who spoke softly and ruined lives effortlessly. But it was Isabella who commanded the true terror of the dining room. They called her the Glass Viper. Rumors whispered that she had once ordered a rival's business burned to the ground because his wife had worn the same designer gown to a charity gala. She was known to mock, belittle, and destroy anyone who fell short of her impossible standards. "Listen to me," Marcus hissed, grabbing Thomas by the shoulder. "You do not look him in the eye. You do not speak to her unless she asks you a direct question. You pour the wine exactly to the crest of the glass. If she sends it back, you apologize and bring another. Do not breathe too loudly. Go." Elena followed Thomas through the swinging doors, carrying a tray of water glasses. The transition from the chaotic, burning kitchen to the main dining room was like stepping into a refrigerated vault. The ambient jazz seemed muted. The clinking of silverware from other patrons was stifled, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Table 7 was situated in a secluded alcove draped in heavy crimson velvet, illuminated only by a single amber pendant light. Adrian sat with his back to the wall, surveying the room with dead, obsidian eyes. He wore a charcoal suit that looked as though it had been molded to his broad shoulders. Beside him sat Isabella. She was devastatingly beautiful and radiated absolute frost. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate chignon. She wore an emerald silk dress that cascaded over her shoulders, and a diamond necklace rested against her collarbone, catching the dim light like shards of ice. She did not look at the menu. She did not look at Adrian. She merely stared at the empty space above the pristine white tablecloth. Thomas approached, his hands trembling slightly as he uncorked a vintage bottle of Barolo. Elena stood 3 paces back, her tray held perfectly level, observing the scene with the trained eye of a former nursing student. She was used to reading symptoms, looking for the underlying truth beneath a patient's outward presentation. Thomas poured the wine. The dark red liquid splashed softly against the crystal. He filled the glass just a fraction of an inch past the crest. Isabella slowly turned her head. Her eyes, a piercing, stormy gray, locked onto Thomas. The silence at the table deepened, becoming something heavy and physical. "What is this?" Isabella asked. Her voice was a soft, melodic purr that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "The Barolo, madam," Thomas stammered. Isabella reached out, her manicured fingers brushing the stem of the glass. "I asked what this is, Thomas, not what the label says, because this looks like a trough meant for a farm animal. Did you think I wanted to bathe in it? I apologize, madam. I will." With a sudden, sharp flick of her wrist, Isabella tipped the glass. The heavy crystal tipped over, spilling the expensive red wine across the pristine white linen like a spreading wound. The glass rolled to the edge and shattered on the hardwood floor with a deafening crack. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. "Clean it up," Isabella commanded, her voice devoid of any emotion. "And send someone out who isn't shaking like a stray dog." Adrian chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "My beautiful viper," he murmured, reaching out to trace the line of her jaw. Always so precise. Thomas scrambled backward, his face flushed with profound humiliation, and practically ran toward the kitchen. Elena remained frozen in place, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved a step forward, to take over the cleanup, but as she stepped into the ambient light, her eyes locked onto Isabella. Isabella was smiling a cold, victorious smile for Adrian, but Elena's gaze drifted downward. Beneath the edge of the table, hidden completely from Adrian's view, Isabella's left hand was clutching the fabric of her own silk dress. Her knuckles were bone white, the tendons straining against the skin, and she was trembling. Not the slight tremor of anger, but the violent, uncontrollable shaking of pure, unadulterated terror. Elena stopped. The narrative she had been fed, the terrifying myth of the glass viper, cracked right down the center. Isabella wasn't a monster reveling in cruelty. She was a woman putting on a performance to survive the predator sitting beside her. Adrian turned his gaze toward Elena. His eyes were completely hollow, lacking any trace of human warmth. "Well?" he prompted softly. "Are you going to clean the mess, or are you going to stand there and stare?" Elena swallowed the lump in her throat, stepped forward into the lion's den, and began to pick up the shattered pieces of glass. The silence in the alcove was oppressive, broken only by the soft, sharp clinking of broken glass, as Elena carefully gathered the shards from the hardwood floor. The spilled wine had soaked into the thick linen tablecloth, the deep red stain creeping toward the edge like a dark omen. Elena kept her head bowed, her focus absolute, but every nerve in her body was hyper-aware of the two figures looming above her. "Get a fresh cloth," Isabella commanded, her tone slicing through the air like a scalpel. "And do try not to drag your feet. The incompetence in this establishment is becoming unbearable." "Yes, madam," Elena replied, her voice steady and neutral. She did not tremble. She did not rush. She moved with deliberate, calm precision. She stood up, holding the folded napkin containing the broken glass, and met Isabella's stormy gray eyes for a fraction of a second. There was a desperate, feral warning in the woman's gaze, a silent demand to look away, to buy into the illusion. Elena offered a brief, imperceptible nod and retreated to the kitchen. When Elena pushed through the swinging doors, Marcus was pacing frantically. "She broke the glass? She broke the glass!" He dragged a hand down his face. "Thomas is hyperventilating in the walk-in cooler. Elena, you have to take the table. I can't send anyone else out there. Just survive the appetizer course. Please." Elena grabbed a stack of fresh, pressed linens and a silver crumber. "I'll handle it, Marcus." Deep breaths. She returned to the dining room, her posture straight, channeling the calm authority she used to rely on during chaotic emergency room rotations before she had to drop out of nursing school. She approached table 7 just as Adrian was taking a call on his sleek, black phone. He spoke in low, clipped Italian, his voice vibrating with a subtle, lethal authority. Isabella sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, her face a sculpted mask of boredom. Elena stepped to the side of the table. "Excuse me, madam. I will replace the linen." Isabella barely acknowledged her, lifting her arms slightly so Elena could pull the stained cloth away and lay down the fresh, snow-white linen. As Elena leaned across the table to smooth out a crease near Isabella's side, she felt the sudden, shocking heat of Isabella's hand gripping her wrist. The grip was agonizingly tight. Elena gasped softly, her eyes snapping to Isabella's face. Isabella was leaning in, her expression twisted into a sneer of pure contempt for the benefit of anyone watching. "Do you think?" Isabella hissed, loud enough for Adrian to hear if he paused his phone call, "that just because you replaced the cloth, you can linger here like a bad smell? Do your job and get out of my sight." But beneath the cruel words, Elena felt Isabella's thumb pressing frantically against the inside of Elena's wrist. It wasn't just a grip, it was a physical anchor. Isabella was anchoring herself to Elena to stop her own hand from shaking while Adrian sat just 2 feet away. Elena forced herself not to pull away. She maintained eye contact, looking past the perfectly applied makeup, past the terrifying reputation, straight into the raw, suffocating panic swimming in Isabella's eyes. As Isabella's sleeve shifted back slightly, Elena saw it. Just above the glittering diamond bracelet, hidden perfectly by the silk cuff, was a constellation of dark, ugly bruises. They were the shape of fingers. Adrian's fingers. "I apologize if I disturbed you, madam," Elena said, her voice remaining perfectly even, though her heart was pounding in her ears. She gently, almost reassuringly, flexed her wrist against Isabella's grip, a silent communication that she understood. "I see you." Isabella's eyes widened slightly, a microscopic fracture in her terrifying facade. For a heartbeat, the sneer faltered, replaced by a look of sheer, agonizing shock. No one had ever looked at her with pity. No one had ever seen through the armor. Adrian ended his call, placing the phone face down on the table with a soft click. Isabella instantly released Elena's wrist, her hand snapping back to her lap, her posture rigid. "Problems with the help, my love?" Adrian asked, his dark eyes sliding lazily toward Elena. The air pressure in the alcove seemed to drop. "Just the usual idiocy," Isabella said smoothly, her voice immediately regaining its icy edge. "They hire these girls off the street and expect them to know how to serve without breathing down our necks." Adrian smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. He reached across the table and placed his large hand over Isabella's right hand. Elena watched as Isabella's entire body tensed, her jaw clenching so hard the muscle fluttered. "We must be patient," Adrian murmured, his thumb stroking Isabella's knuckles in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a threat. "Not everyone is as flawless as you, Isabella. You demand perfection. It is why I adore you." Elena finished setting the new silver and poured fresh water, maintaining the absolute invisibility of a seasoned server. But as she turned to leave, she caught Isabella's reflection in the dark glass of the adjacent window. The Viper was staring at Elena's retreating back, her expression haunted. Elena walked back toward the kitchen, her wrist still throbbing where Isabella had gripped it. The reality of the situation crashed over her. Isabella wasn't a queen ruling a criminal empire alongside her king. She was a hostage. She was playing the role of a monster, demanding impossible perfection, throwing tantrums, acting the part of the terrifying Mafia Fiancée, so that people would hate her, fear her, and stay far away from her. It was a brilliant, tragic defense mechanism. If everyone feared her, no one would get close enough to see the bruises. No one would get close enough to see the cage. And now, Elena had seen the cage. She pushed through the swinging doors into the heat of the kitchen, taking a deep, ragged breath. She knew she should look away. She knew she should keep her head down, collect her tips, and pay her sister's bills. Getting involved with Adrian's world was a death sentence. But as Elena looked down at the faint red marks Isabella's desperate grip had left on her wrist, she knew she couldn't walk away. She had to know the whole truth. Over the next 4 weeks, Elena became a ghost. She traded shifts, skipped breaks, and maneuvered her way into working the VIP section every time Adrian and Isabella arrived. Marcus, terrified of the couple and relieved to have a waitress who didn't dissolve into tears, eagerly accommodated her. Elena used the opportunity to study them. She approached the task with the same clinical, obsessive dedication she had once applied to anatomy textbooks. She learned the rhythm of their terrifying dance. Adrian used Lombra as his neutral ground for conducting business. High-ranking politicians, rival syndicate bosses, and corrupt union leaders would come to table 7. And Isabella was always there. She sat beside Adrian like a beautiful, venomous guard dog. Elena watched as Isabella would coldly dismantle a rival's confidence with a single, biting remark about their suit, or suddenly demand the table be completely reset just as a delicate negotiation was reaching its climax. To the rest of the world, Isabella was an erratic, spoiled tyrant, sabotaging Adrian's dinners. But Elena saw the truth. Isabella's interruptions were painfully strategic. Whenever Adrian was about to agree to a dangerous alliance, or whenever a rival seemed to be gaining the upper hand in a negotiation, Isabella would throw a fit, breaking the tension, distracting the players, and derailing the conversation. She was actively, subtly sabotaging Adrian's expansion, playing the role of the vain, disruptive fiancé to keep him off balance. It was a Tuesday night, raining heavily, when the fragile equilibrium shattered. Adrian was meeting with a massive, brutal-looking man from the harbor docks. The tension at the table was suffocating. Elena was pouring coffee when Isabella suddenly stood up, knocking her chair back with a sharp clatter. "I am suffocating," Isabella declared, her voice ringing out over the quiet dining room. She glared at the harbor boss. "The air in here suddenly smells like cheap cigars and wet dog. I am going to the powder room." Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, barely suppressed fury. "Be quick, Isabella," he warned. his voice low enough that only Elena, standing right beside him, could hear the lethal edge in it. Isabella turned on her heel and marched toward the back hallway. Elena caught a glimpse of her face as she turned. The cold, imperious mask was cracking, revealing a raw, hyperventilating panic underneath. Elena immediately set the coffee pot down. "Excuse me," Elena whispered to Marcus as she passed the maitre d's stand. "Spill in the corridor." She didn't wait for his approval. She practically sprinted down the dimly lit hallway leading to the opulent, marble-lined women's restroom. Elena pushed the heavy oak door open. The restroom was empty, save for Isabella. The Viper was leaning heavily against the edge of the marble sink, her head bowed, both hands gripping the edge of the basin so hard her knuckles were stark white. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving in brutal, stuttering rhythms. The polished, terrifying exterior was completely gone. She looked small, fragile, and entirely broken. Elena let the door click shut behind her and locked it. The sound echoed in the quiet, tiled room. Isabella's head snapped up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her pristine makeup slightly smudged. When she saw Elena, panic flared in her eyes, followed instantly by the reflexive, defensive anger. She stood up straight, desperately trying to pull the armor back on. "What are you doing in here?" Isabella hissed, her voice trembling despite her efforts to harden it. "Did I request a towel, attendant? Get out." Elena didn't move. She stood by the door, her hands resting calmly by her sides. "You're having a panic attack," Elena said softly. Her voice was gentle, devoid of any judgment or fear. "Your breathing is shallow. Your hands are numb." "I said get out." Isabella stepped toward Elena, raising a hand as if to strike her or push her away. Elena didn't flinch. She simply took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and reached out, gently wrapping her hands around Isabella's raised, trembling hand. Isabella froze. The physical contact seemed to short-circuit her brain. No one touched her. People cowered, or they obeyed, or, in Adrian's case, they possessed. But Elena's touch was different. It was grounding. It was human. "Breathe with me," Elena instructed quietly. She placed Isabella's hand against her own chest, right over her heart. "In for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Focus on the rhythm." Isabella stared at Elena, her gray eyes wide and terrified. She tried to pull her hand away, to summon the Viper, but the exhaustion was too deep. A ragged, tearing sob ripped from Isabella's throat, and she collapsed forward. Elena caught her, wrapping her arms around the trembling woman, holding her upright in the middle of the extravagant restroom. Isabella wept. It was a silent, agonizing weeping, her face buried into Elena's shoulder to muffle the sound. Elena just stood there, stroking the back of Isabella's silk-covered shoulders, anchoring her to the present. For 5 long minutes, the mob boss's terrifying fiancé cried in the arms of a waitress earning minimum wage. Slowly, the trembling subsided. Isabella pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Elena, the armor completely stripped away, revealing the terrified girl underneath. "Why are you doing this?" Isabella whispered, her voice hoarse. "You know who he is. You know what he does to people who cross him. If he knows you saw me like this, he will kill you, Elena." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Isabella knew her name. "I'm doing this because I see you," Elena replied firmly. "I see the bruises. I see what you're doing at the table to disrupt his deals. You're not the monster everyone thinks you are, Isabella. You're a prisoner in a golden cage." Isabella let out a bitter, broken laugh. "A cage," she repeated softly. She turned to look at her reflection in the mirror, tracing the faint dark circles under her eyes. "If it were just my life, I would have thrown myself off the balcony a year ago. But it's not just me." She turned back to Elena, her eyes suddenly burning with a fierce, desperate fire. "He has my brother. My little brother. He's keeping him in a private facility. If I run, if I break character, if I do anything to humiliate Adrian, my brother dies." The reality of the nightmare settled heavily into the room. "I can't escape," Isabella whispered, stepping back toward the sink, splashing cold water on her face to fix her makeup. The transformation was terrifying to watch. The vulnerable girl vanished, burying herself deep beneath the icy, impenetrable gaze of the Viper. "Forget what you saw here, Elena. For your own sake. Stay away from me." Isabella unlocked the door and walked back out into the dining room, her posture flawless, her expression terrifying. Elena stayed behind, staring at the empty mirror, realizing she had just crossed a line she could never return from. The weekend service at L'Ombra was a relentless, punishing marathon. The restaurant was booked solid, the dining room, a sea of diamonds, tailored suits, and quiet, dangerous conversations. Adrian was hosting a lavish banquet for his inner circle, 6 tables pushed together in the center of the room. It was a display of absolute power, and sitting at the head of the table, to his right, was Isabella. Tonight, her performance was turned up to a fever pitch. She was drinking champagne like it was water, laughing too loudly, and making cruel, cutting remarks at the expense of Adrian's lieutenants. The men laughed nervously, casting uneasy glances at Adrian, who sat back in his chair, watching Isabella with a dark, calculating amusement. He liked showing her off. He liked that his subordinates feared her almost as much as they feared him. Elena was assigned to manage the banquet service alongside 3 other waiters. She moved around the large table, clearing plates and refilling water glasses, keeping her face completely expressionless. But every time she passed behind Isabella, she felt the electric charge of the woman's tension. Isabella was playing the drunken tyrant, but her back was rigid, and her hands, hidden beneath the table, were constantly moving, twisting a heavy linen napkin into knots. The evening stretched on. By dessert, the atmosphere had grown heavy with cigar smoke and the low hum of aggressive negotiations. Elena approached Isabella to clear her untouched plate of panna cotta. "Are you finished, madam?" Elena asked softly, keeping her eyes downcast. Isabella turned to her, her eyes flashing with fabricated annoyance. "It tastes like chalk," she slurred slightly, waving a manicured hand. "Take it away, and bring me another glass. A clean one this time." "Right away," Elena said. She picked up the plate. As she did, Isabella slammed her hand down onto the table right next to the plate, ostensibly to emphasize her anger. But as she lifted her hand, Elena saw something white resting on the dark mahogany surface beneath the edge of the plate. It was a thick, folded napkin, specifically placed to be hidden from Adrian's sightline. Elena didn't hesitate. With a fluid, practiced motion, she slid the plate over the napkin, trapping it beneath the porcelain, and lifted the entire stack off the table. She turned away before anyone could notice the slight break in her rhythm. She walked quickly back to the kitchen, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The kitchen was in its usual state of organized chaos. Elena slipped into the narrow, unlit pantry where they stored the bulk dry goods, closing the door behind her. She set the plate down on a shelf and pulled the napkin out from underneath. Her hands shook as she unfolded the heavy linen. Written in black eyeliner, the letters jagged and rushed, was a message. Terminal 4. Locker 812. Code 4912. Tomorrow 3 p.m. Passports and the ledger. If I don't get them, Leo dies on Tuesday. He knows I am trying to run. Please. Elena stared at the words, the air in the small pantry suddenly feeling impossibly thin. Leo, the little brother, and the ledger. Isabella wasn't just planning an escape. She was planning to destroy Adrian's empire on her way out. But the most terrifying part of the message was the desperation. He knows I am trying to run. Isabella was under 2 4-hour surveillance. She couldn't go to the train station terminal. She couldn't make the drop. She was entirely trapped, relying on a waitress she barely knew. "Elena!" Marcus's voice barked from the kitchen. "Where are you?" "Table 7 needs coffee." Elena quickly shoved the napkin deep into the pocket of her apron. She smoothed down her uniform, took a deep breath to steady her racing heart, and stepped back out into the blinding light of the kitchen. For the rest of the shift, Elena moved like a machine, her mind racing through the terrifying logistics of what she had been asked to do. The consequences of getting caught were absolute. Adrian did not fire people. He erased them. If she went to that locker, she was stepping entirely out of her world and into his. She thought of her sister, sleeping in the small apartment across the city, depending on Elena's paycheck. She thought of the medical bills stacked on her kitchen counter. She could ignore the note. She could throw it away, come to work on Monday, and pretend she never saw it. But as she walked back out to the dining room and looked at Isabella, who was currently smiling a brittle, fake smile, while Adrian gripped the back of her neck in a possessive, suffocating hold, Elena knew she had already made her choice. At the end of the night, as the restaurant finally emptied, Elena stood by the coat check. Isabella and Adrian walked past her toward the exit. Julian, Adrian's massive, silent bodyguard, flanked them. As they passed, Isabella didn't look at Elena. She kept her chin high, her expression cold. but for a fraction of a second, her steps faltered, just the slightest hesitation in her stride. It was a question. "Are you going to help me?" Elena stood perfectly straight, looking directly at the space Isabella had just occupied, and gave a single, barely perceptible nod. Isabella didn't turn back, but Elena saw the sudden, microscopic drop in her tense shoulders before she stepped out into the rainy night. The Viper had made her silent plea, and Elena had answered. Tomorrow, she was going into the lion's den. The next day, the city was draped in a suffocating, oppressive gray fog. Elena arrived at the central train station at 2:30 p.m. The terminal was a cavernous, echoing hall of rushing commuters, blaring announcements, and the smell of stale coffee and damp wool. She wore a heavy, nondescript trench coat, her hair pulled up under a dark beanie. She felt entirely exposed, convinced that every passing security guard or lingering traveler was one of Adrian's men. She navigated the crowded concourse, her eyes darting toward the digital departure boards, scanning for the bank of public lockers. She found them tucked into a dimly lit corridor near the old transit lines, row upon row of battered gray metal doors. Elena walked past them once, keeping her head down, checking her periphery. Nobody seemed to be following her. She doubled back and stood before locker 812. Her hands were sweating inside her coat pockets. She glanced around one last time, then reached out and punched in the code. 4912. The lock clicked with a loud metallic snap that sounded like a gunshot in Elena's ears. She pulled the door open. Inside rested a thick, manila envelope, taped shut, and a small, worn leather duffel bag. Elena grabbed both, shoved them quickly into her oversized tote bag, slammed the locker shut, and walked away as fast as she could without breaking into a run. She didn't stop moving until she was 3 blocks away, sitting in the back booth of a grimy, empty diner. She ordered a black coffee, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the mug. She unzipped her tote bag and peeled back the tape on the manila envelope. Inside were 2 passports. One bore Isabella's picture. Under a different name, her dark hair dyed a stark, icy blonde. The other passport belonged to a young boy. Leo. He looked no older than 10, his eyes holding the same stormy gray intensity as his sister's. Beside the passports was a thick stack of $100 bills and a small black USB drive. The ledger, the digital map of Adrian's entire corrupt empire money laundering routes, political payoffs, offshore accounts. It was enough to put Adrian away for 5 lifetimes, or enough to get Isabella and Elena killed before the sun set. Elena zipped the bag shut. She had the assets. Now came the impossible part, getting them to Isabella. Elena arrived at Lombra at 4 p.m. for her evening shift. The restaurant was quiet, the staff preparing for the dinner rush. Marcus was arguing with the sommelier in the corner. Elena slipped into the locker room, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stuffed the manila envelope and the USB drive into the hidden, zippered compartment of her server's apron. She locked the duffel bag in her locker. At 6 p.m., the doors opened. The evening service began. Elena was a bundle of live wires. Every time the front door opened, she expected to see Adrian walking in to execute her. But at 7 p.m., the doors opened, and Isabella walked in alone. The entire restaurant paused. Isabella never came to Lombra without Adrian. She looked stunning, wearing a sharp, tailored black suit that made her look more like an assassin than a Mafia bride. She demanded table 7. Marcus, thoroughly panicked, seated her immediately. "Elena," Marcus hissed, grabbing her arm. "You take her. I don't know what she's doing here without him, but keep her happy." Elena nodded, her stomach dropping. She grabbed a water pitcher and approached the alcove. Isabella sat rigidly, her eyes tracking Elena's every movement. "Good evening, madam," Elena said, her voice perfectly steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She poured the water. Isabella didn't look at the menu. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper, masked by the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Did you get it?" Elena didn't look up from the glass. She simply adjusted the napkin on the table. "I have the envelope. The bag is in the staff locker room." Isabella closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, a profound, shuddering sigh escaping her lips. When she opened them, the Viper was gone. The woman looking at Elena was desperately, painfully human. "He found out I was planning something," Isabella whispered rapidly, her eyes darting toward the front door. "He doesn't know what, but he moved his men to the facility where they're keeping Leo. I have to get him out tonight, Elena." During the shift change at 9 p.m., If I wait until tomorrow, he'll move Leo, and I'll never see him again. How are you going to leave? Elena asked softly, pretending to wipe down the edge of the table. Julian is standing right outside the restaurant. I'm not leaving through the front, Isabella said. There's an alley door past the kitchen prep station. It leads to the service alley. I have a car parked 3 blocks away. Isabella looked up, locking eyes with Elena. The vulnerability in her gaze was staggering. I need you to cause a distraction. Something big enough to pull Julian into the main dining room. I need 3 minutes to get into the locker room, get the bag, and get out the back. Elena stared at her. If I cause a distraction, and they figure out I helped you. I know what I am asking of you, Isabella said, her voice cracking slightly. She reached across the table, not grabbing Elena in a painful grip, but gently resting her fingertips over Elena's hand. You are the only person in this city who looked at me and didn't see a monster. You saw me. Please, Elena, help me save my brother. Before Elena could answer, the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant swung open violently. The low hum of conversation in the dining room instantly died. Adrian strode into the room. He looked furious. The dark, immaculate suit he wore seemed to absorb the light around him. Behind him, Julian walked with purposeful, heavy strides. Adrian's eyes scanned the room and locked instantly onto table 7. He saw Isabella sitting there alone. He saw Elena standing close to her. Isabella snatched her hand away from Elena's, her spine snapping straight, her face instantly hardening back into the icy, impenetrable mask of the viper. Go, Isabella whispered from the corner of her mouth, her eyes fixed on the approaching storm. Elena backed away just as Adrian reached the table. He didn't sit down. He loomed over Isabella, his physical presence suffocating. Why are you here, Isabella? Adrian asked. His voice was soft, but it carried the lethal edge of a drawn blade. You were supposed to be at the apartment. I was bored, Isabella replied smoothly, picking up her water glass and taking a delicate sip. The apartment is stifling. I wanted a decent martini. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He looked at Isabella, and then slowly turned his head to look at Elena, who was standing frozen 10 feet away. His dark, hollow eyes seemed to bore straight through her uniform, straight into the hidden pocket where the passports and the ledger burned against her ribs. The alliance was forged, but the execution had just become a suicide mission. Elena took a deep breath, clutching her serving tray. She had exactly 2 hours to figure out how to outsmart the most dangerous man in the city. The tension inside Lombra was thick enough to choke on. Adrian had taken the seat opposite Isabella. He hadn't ordered food. He ordered a single glass of whiskey, staring at Isabella with a cold, predatory intensity. Julian, the massive bodyguard, stood stationed by the front entrance, his eyes scanning the floor like radar. It was 8:15 p.m. Isabella needed to be out of the building by 8:45 p.m. to hit the guard shift change at the facility where her brother was being held. Elena watched them from the service station, her mind racing. The plan was simple on paper. Create a distraction, let Isabella slip through the kitchen to the staff lockers, grab the bag, and exit through the alley. But with Adrian sitting right there, watching her every move, the plan felt like trying to defuse a bomb with a blindfold on. Elena approached the table to refill Adrian's water. You're sweating, waitress, Adrian remarked quietly, not looking up from his whiskey. Elena's heart slammed against her sternum. It's very hot in the kitchen tonight, sir, she replied, fighting to keep her voice level. Is it? Adrian mused. He finally looked up at her. His eyes were dead, devoid of any warmth. Or are you nervous? You seem to hover around this table quite a bit. I am assigned to the VIP section, sir, Elena said, stepping back. Leave her alone, Adrian, Isabella snapped, her voice carrying the perfect pitch of the annoyed, imperious viper. She's an idiot, but she's the only one who doesn't spill things on my shoes. Stop terrorizing the staff, it's boring. Adrian slowly turned his gaze back to Isabella. A terrifying, thin smile crept across his face. You are very brave tonight, my love. Wandering out of the apartment, defending the help. It almost makes me wonder what you're hiding. Isabella didn't flinch. She picked up her martini glass and took a slow sip. The only thing I'm hiding is my absolute exhaustion with your paranoia. I'm going to the restroom to fix my lipstick. Try not to murder anyone while I'm gone. It ruins my appetite. Isabella stood up. She grabbed her small clutch purse and walked with purposeful, elegant strides toward the back hallway. She didn't look at Elena. This was it. The window was opening. Adrian watched her go, his eyes narrowing. He lifted a finger. a subtle gesture directed toward the front door. Julian immediately pushed off the wall and began walking toward the back hallway to follow Isabella. Elena had to act. Now, she turned rapidly toward the main service station, where a massive, tiered silver cart was loaded with dirty dishes, stacked precariously high with delicate porcelain and crystal from a recently cleared 12-top table. Marcus was standing right next to it, frantically checking the reservation book. Elena took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and intentionally stepped forward, jamming her heavy work shoe violently against the wheel lock of the cart. She pushed with all her weight, twisting her body to make it look like she had slipped on a wet patch of floor. The cart lurched forward, entirely unbalanced. With a deafening, catastrophic crash that sounded like a building collapsing, the entire cart tipped over. Hundreds of plates, wine glasses, and silver cutlery shattered against the hardwood floor in an explosive wave of noise and destruction. The entire restaurant screamed. Diners jumped out of their seats. Marcus shrieked, clutching his chest. Adrian was out of his chair in a millisecond, his hand instinctively reaching into his jacket. Julian, halfway down the corridor toward the restrooms, spun around at the sound of the crash, drawing his weapon, rushing back into the main dining room, his eyes scanning wildly for a shooter. "I am so sorry," Elena cried out, dropping to her knees amid the ruins of shattered plates and broken glass, waving her hands frantically. "I slipped. Oh my God, I'm so sorry." Marcus looked like he was going to have a stroke. "Are you insane?" "Look at this mess." Julian, realizing it was just a clumsy waitress, holstered his weapon, cursing loudly in Italian. He stepped forward to grab Elena by the arm, ready to drag her out of the restaurant himself. "Leave her," Adrian commanded sharply. He was staring at Elena, his eyes dark with suspicion. The distraction was almost too perfect. He looked toward the back hallway. "Julian, check the restroom. Now." Elena's blood ran cold. She had bought Isabella exactly 45 seconds. It wasn't enough. Isabella had to get from the hallway, into the kitchen, into the locker room, and out the back door. As Julian turned to jog down the hallway, Elena used the chaos to her advantage. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, clutching a handful of broken porcelain. She purposely dragged her palm across a sharp edge of a shattered wine glass. The cut was deep and immediate. Blood welled up, bright red and startling. "Oh!" Elena gasped loudly, holding up her bleeding, shaking hand. "Marcus, I'm cut. It's deep." The sight of blood in the pristine dining room elevated the panic. Diners gasped. Marcus turned pale white. "Get her to the kitchen," Marcus yelled to another waiter. "Get the first aid kit! Hurry!" The other waiter hauled Elena to her feet and practically dragged her through the swinging double doors into the kitchen. The kitchen staff, who had frozen at the sound of the crash, scrambled out of the way. "Keep moving," Elena hissed to the waiter, grabbing a clean towel and wrapping it tightly around her bleeding hand. "I need the kit in the back office." They rushed past the cooking stations, heading straight for the rear corridor that led to the staff lockers and the alley door. Elena's eyes darted frantically. The hallway was empty. The door to the locker room was slightly ajar. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the alleyway door. It was heavy, metallic, and unmistakable. Someone had kicked the fire door open. Elena stopped dead in her tracks, pulling her arm away from the waiter. "Go get Marcus," she ordered the bewildered boy. "Tell him I need a bandage. Go." The boy ran back toward the main kitchen. Elena stepped forward, pushing the locker room door open completely. The room was empty. Her locker was hanging wide open. The duffel bag was gone. Isabella had made it. She had the passports, the money, and the ledger. She was out. Relief washed over Elena so intensely she felt dizzy. She leaned against the cold metal lockers, gripping her bleeding hand, taking a deep, shuddering breath. It was done. Isabella was going to save her brother. But as Elena turned to walk back into the kitchen, the heavy swinging doors burst open violently. Julian stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the entire exit. His face was twisted in a mask of pure rage. In his right hand, he held Isabella's emerald clutch purse. He had found it abandoned in the restroom. Julian looked at Elena, taking in her bleeding hand, her pale face, and the open locker behind her. A dark, terrifying understanding dawned in his eyes. "Where is she?" Julian growled, stepping into the room and locking the door behind him. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoing through the small, fluorescent-lit locker room sounded like a death sentence. Julian stepped forward, the physical mass of him completely suffocating the space. He threw Isabella's emerald clutch onto a bench. "I asked you a question, waitress," Julian rumbled, his voice low and vibrating with menace. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a heavy, dark pistol, letting it rest casually by his side. Where did she go? Elena pressed her back against the cold metal lockers, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She gripped her bleeding hand, the towel soaking through with red. She forced herself to channel the utter panic of a terrified civilian. I don't know what you're talking about," Elena stammered, letting her voice crack, tears of genuine pain and fear pricking her eyes. "I cut my hand. I just came back here for the first aid kit. Please." Julian stared at her, his dead eyes sweeping over her bloody hand, the open locker, and the door leading to the alleyway. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them until Elena could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint on his breath. "You think I'm stupid?" he whispered. The cart crashes. You bleed everywhere. The Viper disappears. Adrian thinks it's a coincidence. I do not. He suddenly lunged forward, his massive hand wrapping around Elena's throat, slamming the back of her head against the metal lockers with a jarring crack. Elena gasped, clawing desperately at his thick fingers. Black spots danced at the edge of her vision. "Who opened the alley door?" Julian demanded, lifting her slightly off the ground. Elena couldn't breathe. She gagged, her legs kicking weakly against his shins. She knew if she spoke, if she admitted anything, she was dead. She had to hold out. She just needed to give Isabella a few more minutes to get the car started and get away. Suddenly, the door handle rattled aggressively from the outside. Julian didn't flinch, his grip remaining iron tight. "Julian," Adrian's voice barked from the other side of the door, sharp and commanding. "Open the door." Julian's jaw tightened. He held Elena for 3 agonizing seconds longer before abruptly releasing her. Elena collapsed to the floor, coughing violently, dragging ragged breaths of air into her burning lungs. Julian unlocked the door and pulled it open. Adrian stood in the doorway, the ambient light of the kitchen casting long, dark shadows across his tailored suit. He looked past Julian, his eyes falling on Elena, who was huddled on the floor, gasping for air, her hand bleeding onto the linoleum. Adrian stepped into the room. He didn't look angry. He looked terrifyingly calm. He surveyed the open locker, the alley door, and Isabella's discarded purse. He pieced the puzzle together with lethal speed. "She ran," Adrian stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, boss," Julian said, holstering his weapon. "Out the back. I can take the men and sweep the perimeter." "She couldn't have gotten far." "No," Adrian said softly. He slowly turned his gaze back to Elena. "She didn't run wildly. She planned this. Isabella is a creature of comfort. She would not leave without resources. Money, passports, a destination." He crouched down, his immaculate trousers hovering inches from the dirty floor, bringing his face level with Elena's. "You," Adrian whispered, "the clumsy waitress who spills wine and crashes carts." Elena stared back at him, her throat bruised and throbbing, refusing to break eye contact. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a strange, resilient defiance began to take root. She was done cowering. "You helped her," Adrian said. He reached out and suddenly grabbed Elena by the collar of her uniform, hauling her to her feet with shocking, effortless strength. He slammed her against the lockers, pinning her there. "Where is she going?" "I don't know," Elena rasped, her voice hoarse from Julian's grip. "I don't know anything. She just paid me to cause a distraction." Adrian smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. A lie. Isabella does not trust the help. She trusts fear. If she asked you for help, she told you why. She told you where. He leaned in closer, his voice a lethal whisper. "I am going to ask you one more time. Where is my fiancée?" "She's not your fiancée," Elena spat, the words tearing out of her before she could stop them. "She's your prisoner, and she's gone." Silence slammed into the room. Julian shifted uncomfortably behind Adrian. No one spoke to Adrian like that. Ever. Adrian's eyes darkened, the calm facade finally fracturing, revealing the monstrous rage boiling beneath. He raised his hand, preparing to strike her down. "Stop." The voice came from the doorway. It was soft, melodic, and completely commanding. Adrian froze. Elena gasped, standing in the doorway, perfectly composed. the heavy duffel bag slung over her shoulder, was Isabella. She hadn't run. Isabella stepped into the locker room, the overhead light catching the icy determination in her gray eyes. She looked at Elena, seeing the bruises forming on her neck, the blood on her hand. A flash of profound guilt and fiery rage crossed Isabella's face, but she instantly suppressed it. The viper returned, colder and more deadly than ever. "Let her go, Adrian," Isabella commanded. She dropped the heavy duffel bag to the floor with a loud thud. Adrian slowly released Elena. Stepping back, his eyes locked on Isabella. He looked bewildered, an expression Elena had never seen on the crime boss's face. "You came back," he murmured. "I couldn't leave," Isabella said smoothly, her posture perfect, refusing to show an ounce of fear. "Not without finishing this." "Finishing what?" Adrian asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "You thought you could pack a bag and walk out on me?" "You belong to me, Isabella. You and your little brother." Isabella didn't flinch at the mention of Leo. She reached into the pocket of her tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out the small, black USB drive. Elena's heart stopped. The ledger, the one piece of leverage Isabella needed to trade for her brother's life. She hadn't run because she knew Adrian would just hunt them down. She came back to cut the head off the snake. "I belong to no one," Isabella said softly, holding the USB drive up between her thumb and forefinger. "And as of 5 minutes ago, Adrian, you have nothing." The small locker room felt like the inside of a pressurized cabin seconds before structural failure. Adrian stared at the small black USB drive pinched between Isabella's elegant fingers. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking rapidly beneath his skin. For the first time, the imposing, untouchable crime boss looked profoundly unsettled. "What is that?" Adrian demanded, his voice dropping into a register that promised absolute violence. "This?" Isabella smiled, a sharp, humorless curving of her lips. She stepped fully into the room, kicking the door shut behind her. Julian immediately moved to block the exit, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. "This, Adrian, is your entire life. 10 years of offshore accounts, shell companies, political bribes, and the exact coordinates of every shipment moving through the docks. The ledger you thought was safely locked in your private vault." Adrian's eyes widened slightly. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her, as if seeing a stranger wearing his fiancée's face. "You couldn't have accessed the vault. It requires my biometric scan." "I didn't access the vault," Isabella said calmly. "I cloned your drive 3 months ago when you were passed out on painkillers after your little disagreement with the Rossi family. I've been updating it wirelessly ever since." She tilted her head, her gray eyes burning with years of suppressed hatred. "You thought I was just a beautiful, stupid accessory. You thought making me play the monster at your dinners was amusing. But while you were busy showing me off, I was watching every password you entered, memorizing every account number, every associate's name." Adrian took a slow, menacing step toward her. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Isabella. Give me the drive, now. If you hand it over, I might let the waitress live." Isabella laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the metal lockers. "You don't understand, Adrian. This isn't a negotiation. The game is already over." She glanced at Elena, who was still leaning against the lockers, her hand tightly wrapped in the bloody towel. Isabella gave her a fractional, reassuring nod. 20 minutes ago," Isabella continued, her gaze snapping back to Adrian, "while your gorilla was choking an innocent woman, my associate, a very reliable man whom you believe works for you, walked into the facility holding Leo. He had a forged transfer order bearing your digital signature. A signature I lifted from this drive." Adrian stopped. The color began to drain from his face. "My brother is currently in a car, heading toward a private airfield," Isabella stated, her voice ringing with triumphant, absolute certainty. "He is safe, and you have lost your leverage." "You lying bitch," Julian growled, pulling his gun entirely from its holster, aiming it squarely at Isabella's chest. Isabella didn't even blink at the weapon. She kept her eyes locked on Adrian. "Shoot me, Julian. Go ahead. But understand this. That drive in my hand is just a physical copy. 10 minutes ago, I set up a dead man's switch on a secure server. If I don't enter a specific passcode every 12 hours, the entire contents of that ledger will be blasted simultaneously to the FBI, the DEA, and the heads of the 3 rival families you've been stealing from." Adrian stared at her. The silence was absolute, heavy with the realization of total defeat. Isabella had outmaneuvered him completely. She had used the persona he forced upon her, the erratic, hated, spoiled viper, to render herself invisible, building the snare right under his nose. "You would destroy everything we built?" Adrian asked, his voice oddly quiet, stripped of its usual venom. "You built a cage, Adrian," Isabella replied coldly. "I'm just burning it down." She tossed the black USB drive onto the floor between them. It clattered against the linoleum. "Take it, it's useless to me now. But if you try to follow me, if you ever come looking for me or my brother, the switch triggers, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal supermax, assuming the Rossi family doesn't get to you first." Adrian looked down at the drive, then back up at Isabella. The terrifying composure he had maintained for years finally shattered. He looked entirely broken, outplayed by the woman he thought he owned. He slowly raised a hand, gesturing to Julian. "Stand down," Adrian rasped. Julian looked at his boss, confused and furious. "Boss, we can't let her." "I said stand down," Adrian roared, the sudden explosion of volume making both Elena and Julian flinch. Julian slowly lowered the gun. Isabella didn't waste a second. She reached down, picked up the heavy duffel bag, and slung it over her shoulder. She turned toward Elena, stepping past the defeated crime boss. She reached out and gently grabbed Elena's uninjured arm. "Come with me," Isabella said softly, the viper entirely gone, leaving only the protective, fierce woman underneath. "He knows what you did. You can't stay here." Elena looked at Adrian, who was staring at the wall, a hollow shell of the terrifying myth he had projected. Then she looked at Isabella. She thought of her sister, the debts, the suffocating fear of working under Marcus and the syndicate. Isabella was offering her a way out, a dangerous way out, but a real one. Elena nodded once. She stood up straight, ignoring the throbbing pain in her neck and hand. Isabella pushed the alley door open. The cool, damp night air rushed into the stifling locker room. Without looking back at Adrian, Isabella and Elena stepped out into the darkness, leaving the ruins of the Empire behind them. The alley behind Lombra was slick with rain, reflecting the dull orange glow of the street lamps like spilled copper. The cold air hit Elena's face, sharp and biting, snapping her out of the adrenaline-fueled haze. She followed Isabella down the narrow brick corridor, their footsteps echoing loudly against the brick walls. A sleek, black town car was idling at the mouth of the alley. The engine hummed with a low, powerful vibration. As they approached, the rear passenger door swung open. Inside, sitting in the deep leather seats, was a young boy. He had Isabella's dark hair and pale, stormy eyes. He looked terrified until he saw Isabella emerge from the shadows. "Izzy!" the boy cried out, scrambling forward. Isabella dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the wet pavement and practically dove into the back seat, wrapping her arms around her brother. The sound she made, a ragged, breathless sob of pure, unadulterated relief, was something Elena would never forget. It was the sound of a cage door finally breaking open. Elena stood by the open door, awkwardly clutching her bleeding hand, giving them a moment. The driver, an older man with a scarred face, stepped out and moved to put the duffel bag in the trunk. He nodded respectfully to Elena. Isabella pulled back from her brother, cupping his face, kissing his forehead before turning back to Elena. She stepped out of the car, standing in the rain, the tailored black suit she wore already dampening. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, the stack of $100 bills Elena had retrieved from the locker. She held it out to Elena. "This is enough to clear your sister's medical debts, and enough for you both to leave the city," Isabella said, her voice steady and thick with emotion. "Adrian is ruined, but his men will be angry. You cannot go back to that restaurant, Elena. You cannot go back to your apartment tonight. Take your sister and go." Elena looked at the envelope. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was freedom. She reached out with her uninjured hand and took it, the thick paper heavy with implication. "What about you?" Elena asked softly. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere cold." Isabella smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her face entirely. Without the weight of the viper's mask, she looked incredibly young and entirely beautiful. "Somewhere he can never find us." Isabella stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Elena in a tight, fierce embrace. Elena hugged her back, ignoring the pain in her ribs, holding on to the woman she had feared just a month ago. "You saved my life," Isabella whispered into Elena's shoulder. "You saw the truth when everyone else only wanted to see the monster. I will never forget you, Elena. Stay safe, Isabella." Elena replied, pulling back, her own eyes burning with tears. Isabella gave her one last, profound look of gratitude, then turned and slid into the back of the town car. The heavy door closed with a solid, definitive thud. The driver got in, and the car pulled away from the curb, its red taillights bleeding into the rainy night until it disappeared around the corner. Elena stood alone on the street corner. The envelope of cash was heavy in her pocket. Her hand throbbed, and her neck ached where Julian had grabbed her. But for the first time in years, she felt completely, terrifyingly light. She turned and looked back down the alley toward the rear entrance of Lombra. She thought about walking back in, throwing her apron at Marcus, and quitting in front of the entire terrified staff. But she realized they weren't worth the effort. The illusion was broken. Adrian was just a man, Marcus was just a coward, and the restaurant was just a room full of people pretending to be important. Elena didn't go back inside. She didn't return to the kitchen, or the yelling, or the fear. She turned her back on the velvet drapes and the crystal chandeliers, pulling her coat tight against the cold wind. She walked toward the subway, pulling her phone from her pocket with her good hand. She dialed her sister's number. It rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. "Hey," Elena said, a smile breaking across her face, bright and undeniable. "Pack a bag. We're going on a trip." As she descended the concrete stairs into the subway station, leaving the city's shadows behind, Elena knew the mythology of the glass viper would live on in the whispered rumors of the restaurant staff. They would talk about the terrifying fiancé who vanished into thin air, but Elena knew the hidden truth. There was no viper. There was only a sister who fought a monster, and a waitress who chose to look closely enough to see the cage. And together, they had broken it.